Hey everybody, this is Tim with Op-Ed Daily. Today I'd like to talk to you guys about taxes. Specifically, I'd like to talk to you about tax burden. And I know this is a boring topic and probably many of you aren't going to want to listen to this whole clip, but I suggest that you do because this is an important way of thinking about taxes differently from what you normally hear it. Because usually we hear from the right and the left about flat numbers. We hear about percentages, but what we don't hear about is the tax burden associated with the percentages. Tax burden is important because to a wealthy person, having to pay 30% of his check in taxes and only receiving 70% is not as burdensome as somebody making $60,000 and then paying 30% of his check. The tax burden for the person paying 30% of his check and making $60,000 a year is much higher than the tax burden associated with a wealthy person paying 30% of his taxes. Yes, it's true that the wealthy person is paying more in raw numbers in taxes, but it's also true that his tax burden is less. And when I say burden, I am referring to how much it hurts a person's quality of life, how much it hurts a person's ability to live in the way that most Americans want to live. I believe that most Americans want to go to work, come home, spend time with their family, and not have to worry about, oh, the rent's due, or oh, my car payment is due, or oh, my insurance is due. Americans don't want to have to worry about that. If they're working 40 hours a week and they're contributing to society in that way, and they're purchasing the way the government and corporations want us to do, then we should be able to have a fairly decent life without stress or financial worry. If you have a job in this country, that job should provide you with enough money to support your family without worry. Unfortunately, we don't have that. And nowadays, we have people making $60,000 a year paying the same percentage or even more than people making millions and billions of dollars. Look at GE. There were several years where GE paid 0% and even got a tax refund at the end of the year, even though they were recording record profits. How is that done? Through tax loopholes, accountants, that sort of thing. But most Americans can't afford a tax accountant. They can't afford somebody that can go through their line by line and find the way to screw the government out of as much money as possible. Most people just want to file their taxes and be done with it. And that's fine. But that's why it's important to have a progressive tax structure that takes tax burden into consideration instead of just raw numbers. So somebody that makes $10 million a year, if you took 50% of that and they only received $5 million in that year, do you think that that person is struggling in life? No. That person will be able to have a wonderful life. That person can buy multiple homes. That person can buy yachts, buildings, land, all kinds of things that everyday Americans aren't going to be able to afford. And that's fine. That's fine. They can do that. They earned the money. They deserve to have good things. I fully believe that. But what I also believe is that their burden needs to match that of poor and middle class Americans. I used to make $60,000 a year and I paid 33% in taxes. So I actually only brought home about $40,000 a year. That was a burden on me. Now back then that was a good wage. It's not a good wage anymore. It's a decent wage. It could get an American by, depending on how many children he or she has. But it's not a good wage. To many, unfortunately, it would be considered a good wage. But the reality of it is $40,000 doesn't go very far anymore. But that person that makes $5 million after paying 50% of his tax, do you think he's hurting at all? No. This is also important to think about when it comes to crime and punishment. Now, if you speed, you're supposed to be punished with a fine. Let's say that fine is $150. Now, if a wealthy person were to be speeding and they got a $150 fine, is that much of a punishment? No, because that $150 to a wealthy person may be pocket change. But to a poor or middle class person, it's going to devastate them. It could really ruin their life for 6 months to a year. It can take some people 6 months to a year to pay for a $150 unintended expenditure. That's why it's important that we not just look at the raw data, but that we actually think about the burden that these taxes are going to have on wealthy people. That's why I'd also like to bring up the top marginal tax rate. You see, the top marginal tax rate are taxes above a certain amount of money, that money in the top bracket. So let's say if you made $500 million in a year, which does happen in this country. So if you make $500 million in a year, this is just an example, by the way, you are probably going to pay 28 to 30% in taxes, I believe is the top marginal tax rate in this country now. After the Depression, they had to do something in this country to even out the playing field and make it fair or more fair for everybody. So they increased the top marginal tax rate, and in some years it was up to 90%, which means after a certain amount of money, the government would take 90% of that person's income. Now that may seem unfair to most people, but if you think about it, if you're making $500 million a year, what purpose does it serve for you, your family, and your life to make more on a personal level, mind you? On a single family income, somebody making $500 million a year, they can do whatever they want and not worry about anything in terms of financial stress. So this top marginal tax rate is now fairly low. So even if you make these god-awful amounts of money, you're still paying probably less than what a middle-class American is paying when making $60,000 a year. That's not fair. It's not fair that a middle-class American has to be burdened more from taxes than a wealthy person. If you want to talk about flat tax, we need to scratch that idea and talk about flat burden. The burden on a person when being taxed should be the same all across the board. It should harm your life in the same way because that's the only fair way to deal with taxes. So if it hurts somebody making $60,000 a year this much, then it needs to hurt somebody making $10 million a year this much. That's the important thing to think about. And you can call it socialism if you want to. I don't really care. But what it is fair. It's fair for everybody. And it will increase the revenue of our government so that we can put money back into our infrastructure, put money back into education and healthcare and all of these things that the majority of Americans depend on. Food stamps is such an important thing and actually creates economic activity in this country. Yet the Republicans want to cut that funding. And all that will do is hurt Americans more. And they're doing this, they're cutting all of these things just so that they can afford to give wealthy Americans tax breaks. Because when you give a wealthy American a tax break, or anybody a tax break, you are decreasing your revenue. And the only way to offset the decrease in revenue is to cut spending. Now, Republicans want to argue that increased spending is bad. Well, that's true, but decreasing revenue is not good. Decreasing revenue to help a small minority of people in this country is a bad idea. So the next time you send a letter to your representative, whomever that may be, I think it's important that you bring up the tax burden thing. Our taxes need to be more progressive in this country. They are not progressive. They harm the majority of the people in this America, while they allow the wealthiest among us to get away scot-free. Now, don't take this to mean that I think wealthy Americans should be harmed by taxes in any way. I don't believe that at all. I'm glad we have wealthy Americans because it gives something to aspire to for a lot of Americans. It's like, oh, I can make it in this country. I can become rich in this country. Well, it's harder nowadays because we don't fund the things necessary for everybody to pursue the American dream in the same way. The only way to fund those things is to get that money from somewhere, and that somewhere is only going to be able to come from the people that can afford it. So that's all I wanted to say today. If you guys disagree, please tell me in the comments. I'd like to hear from everybody. If you agree, I'd like to hear from you as well. Share this on Facebook. Let's get this out there so that people can start looking in taxes in a different way, because this is very important that we don't allow the Republican ideology and the Republicans' thoughts on the economy go through into this nation, because it's going to harm everybody ultimately. That's all I've got to say. You guys have a good day, and I'll see you later.